11 children, no birth certificates, no past, no legal trail. They appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as easily. You weren't supposed to know this story. You weren't supposed to hear about the Follings, and if you're watching this now, understand this isn't just a story. It's a fracture in the surface of reality itself. Because what begins as a family drama spirals into psychological warfare, systemic failure, and something older than paperwork or parenting. Something ancient, ritualistic, and designed for control. The Follings, Howard and Margaret, they looked like the American dream. A Victorian mansion, church smiles, donations to charities, perfectly ironed linen. But every smile masked a calculation. Every hug, a transaction. Every child, a piece in something much darker. This story was nearly lost, buried in the quiet town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a place built on trust, routine, and small-town silence. But truth has a way of leaking through cracks, and tonight you're going to follow that leak straight into the abyss. You'll hear testimonies that were buried by officials. You'll learn of rooms locked for decades, children seen once, then never again. And somewhere between the basement and the attic, you'll begin to feel it. This isn't just about the Follings. This is about something older than them, a system that feeds on the forgotten. So buckle in, because by the end of this video, you won't just know the truth, you'll feel it under your skin. And once you see behind this curtain, you can't unsee it. That's your warning. Welcome to the macabre history of the Follings. They adopted 11 kids, none with birth certificates, and none of them were ever meant to be found. It started, as most dark things do, with something beautiful. A Victorian estate that rose like a relic from another time, 3 stories high with glass window, doors that caught the sunrise like stained glass, hidden just enough behind the oaks to make it feel sacred, or secret. Howard Falling bought the house in the spring of 1978. An investment banker with perfect cufflinks and a voice like velvet, he wasn't the kind of man you questioned. He was the kind you obeyed. Margaret, his wife, was softer on the surface, a former pediatric nurse, always immaculately dressed, always whispering kind things. But kindness can be camouflage, and when used well, it is the perfect disguise for a predator. The neighbors adored them, brought casseroles, gave them plaques at church, called them pillars of the community, because that's how manipulation works. You don't build fear, you build admiration, control disguised as generosity. 2 years after moving in, they adopted their first child, James. No one knew where he came from, no hospital records, no agency press release. Just one Sunday, there he was, in Margaret's arms, with eyes too quiet for a child and a smile that looked practiced. Then came Elizabeth, then Thomas, then Catherine, then William. By 1985, 5 children, all under 6, all adopted, but none enrolled in school, none appeared in public records, none had doctors or dentists or even a single photograph in town yearbooks. They were ghosts, walking, eating, breathing ghosts. And when someone asked, Margaret would smile that frozen smile and say, "Some children just need privacy to heal." But healing doesn't look like isolation. And children don't whisper when they play. They don't flinch when their mother raises her hand to brush their hair. And they don't stare into space like they're waiting for permission to exist. One neighbor, a retired teacher, once tried to speak up, asked Howard why the children weren't seen more. Howard just chuckled and said, "You know, it's funny what people think they're entitled to." And that was the end of the conversation. Because when power smiles at you, you don't push back. You nod. You go home. You silence that flicker of instinct that says, something is deeply, deeply wrong here. But the Follings didn't just silence the town. They rewrote the rules of what a family is. And no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not the state, had the courage to ask, who are these children, really? The first official crack came on a summer day in 1987. 9-year-old Thomas Falling fell from a tree, a compound fracture, the bone split, twisted, exposed. The kind of injury that demands emergency care. But Margaret didn't call an ambulance. She didn't even call a doctor. Instead, she dragged the boy into the house, locked the doors, and attempted to set the bone herself, like it was a doll, not a child. What followed was infection, fever, delirium. And only when Thomas began convulsing from septic shock did Howard break character and drive him to Millbrook General Hospital. He told the front desk it was a minor fall, told the doctor they were in between providers, told the nurse that the boy was shy around strangers. But Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't stupid. She'd seen trauma before, not just the medical kind, but the kind that walks into a room and doesn't speak unless told to. Thomas never cried, never screamed. He just stared at the ceiling while they prepped him for surgery, his lips moving in silence like he was praying or repeating instructions. When Dr. Chen asked for his medical records, Howard said they'd been lost in a fire. When she pushed harder, he threatened to remove the boy, said she was overstepping. She filed a report that night. Child Protective Services sent a man named David Morris. He spent less than 2 hours at the Folling home, interviewed the children while Margaret sat behind them. Not one child made eye contact, not one deviated from their script. 3 weeks later, the case was closed. The report concluded, no signs of abuse, home appears stable, children are homeschooled, Mrs. Folling has medical background. The town exhaled. Everyone wanted it to be over, because looking closer meant admitting you missed something enormous, something evil. And evil doesn't just hide, it wears pearls, it bakes pies for fundraisers, it donates to the fire department. But while the town chose comfort, one person stayed uneasy. Because Dr. Chen saw what the report didn't. Thomas didn't act like a child who had been hurt. He acted like a prisoner who had failed to follow orders, and that's the kind of silence that doesn't grow in chaos. It grows in systems, it grows in routines, it grows in captivity. By 1990, the Follings had 11 children. 11. No biological ties, no visible pasts, no confirmed legal identities, not a single birth certificate verified by the state. But no one dared to confront it, because by then the town of Millbrook didn't see the Follings as suspicious. They saw them as untouchable. Howard had become a board member of 3 local charities, a regular donor to the church, and a mentor to young business owners. Margaret volunteered with the elderly, hosted book clubs, and kept that same angelic aura around her like armor. But something had changed in the eyes of the children. When they walked into church, they didn't look around, they didn't smile, they didn't fidget like normal kids. They walked in perfect lines, silent, identical, like marionettes waiting for a cue. People whispered, sure, but no one acted. Until the Fletchers moved in. Michael and Susan Fletcher were new to Millbrook, outsiders, not bred into the quiet culture of looking away. Susan was a seasoned social worker, Michael a journalist with a nose for stories that smelled wrong. And from the moment they met the Folling children, Susan knew something wasn't right. They're conditioned, she told her husband, conditioned to perform. Every answer is rehearsed. Every reaction is delayed, like they're scanning for approval. Susan began documenting, keeping quiet notes after every interaction, changes in behavior, bruises that were dismissed, odd phrases the children repeated in unison, as if memorized. Meanwhile, Michael started digging into local adoption records. What he found didn't add up. Different agencies, different states, but always the same result. A child placed with the Follings and no public follow-up. No school enrollment, no medical visits, no paper trail. They weren't adopting children. They were erasing them. Then came the locked 3rd floor. Susan had been invited for tea. Margaret was gracious, charming. But while she fetched more cookies from the kitchen, Susan heard something. A shuffling sound. A voice. A child's voice. Faint. Hoarse. Behind a locked door. When she asked about it, Margaret didn't flinch. Old house, she smiled. It makes noises. But Susan knew the difference between an old house creaking and a child too afraid to cry. And in that moment, she made a choice. To stop being polite. to stop smiling, and to start recording everything, because whatever was behind that door wasn't just another child. It was a secret someone wanted buried. Susan's instincts were no longer whispers in the back of her mind. They were sirens. That night, she typed everything she could remember into a locked document. Names, dates, details of every child, what they wore, how they spoke, the way they flinched when Margaret entered a room. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was terrified. But fear is a funny thing. In some people, it creates paralysis. In Susan Fletcher, it forged obsession. She filed a formal inquiry to Child Protective Services. Attached were her notes, a timeline, and Michael's research into the Follings adoption trail. Everything carefully packaged, calm and factual, because emotion, she knew, would get her dismissed. Then she waited. Days passed, then weeks. No call, no visit, no response, not even an acknowledgement. Then Michael noticed something chilling. The documents he had pulled from state archives, digital scans of adoption forms, began disappearing. Links broken, files corrupted, contact emails bouncing back. It was as if someone, or something, was scrubbing the record. That's when he said it aloud for the first time. This goes higher than we think. And he was right. Because just when Susan began considering direct police intervention, a knock came at their door. Not from the police, not from CPS, but from Margaret Folling, polite as ever, holding a covered dish of casserole, smiling that smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "I heard you weren't feeling well," she cooed. Susan stood frozen in the doorway, heart pounding. How did she know I filed anything? How did she know? Margaret stepped closer. "You know, Susan, it's easy to misunderstand what you see in families like ours. Trauma creates unusual bonds, but love isn't always what it looks like on television." She set the casserole down without permission and walked out, never breaking eye contact. That night, Susan sat up in bed and whispered, "She's warning me." Michael, gripping her hand, whispered back, "No, she's letting you know she's watching." What they didn't know then was that by filing that report, they hadn't just poked the bear, they had opened the gate, and something was about to come through, something far older than the Follings. The Follings were no longer just a strange family on the hill. They were something else, a name whispered in certain county buildings with a chill, a door you didn't knock on twice, but Susan couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, especially after what happened that weekend. Michael, still digging, discovered something horrifying. He traced one of the Follings' supposed adoptions, a boy named Caleb, around 8 years old, only the orphanage where Caleb was allegedly adopted from didn't exist, not anymore. According to state records, Brookside Haven, the institution listed on Caleb's adoption form, was condemned in 1993 after a fire destroyed most of its structure. The problem? Caleb was adopted in 2002. Michael stared at the charred registry photo of the orphanage, stunned. Then something caught his eye, a photo, warped by smoke damage, but clear enough. A group of children in line outside the building, some barefoot, some holding ragged dolls, third from the right. Was Caleb. Same eyes, same haircut, same expression, but if that photo was from before the fire, and the fire happened in 93, then how was Caleb adopted years later, unchanged? Michael zoomed in, tried reverse image searching. Nothing. He ran facial recognition, not a single match, not in school records, not in medical databases, not even in the DMV, as if the boy didn't legally exist, as if none of them did. And just when he was about to show Susan, his laptop froze. The screen turned black. Then lines of text began to appear. "You're looking for ghosts in places meant to forget." Then the screen blinked off completely. Dead. Unresponsive. Michael's hands shook. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was surveillance. The next day, Susan received an envelope at work. No return address, no stamp, just one word typed on the front. "Stop." Inside was a photo, not printed, Polaroid of Susan, sleeping in bed, taken from inside her room. That night, she left every light on in the house. Michael sat in the hallway with a baseball bat shaking. The message was clear. We see you, we know what you're doing, and we will erase you, just like them. But the Fletchers had already passed the threshold. They couldn't stop, because if they did, they wouldn't just lose the trail, they'd lose each other. They tried to go to the police. Susan brought a folder full of notes, names, adoption inconsistencies, the photo of Caleb, even the threatening Polaroid. The officer behind the desk didn't even look inside. He tapped his pen, forced a smile, and said, "I think you've been watching too many crime shows, ma'am." That was it. No report, no case file, just a polite dismissal, and a second officer standing quietly behind her, arms folded, watching her too closely. As Susan turned to leave, she saw something that froze her mid-step, pinned to the community bulletin board in the hallway. A church flyer for a Sunday potluck at the Chapel of the Pure Lamb. At the bottom, in small, almost invisible print, hosted at the Follings residence. By invitation only. A private church service. In a private home. With a congregation made up almost entirely of children. She didn't speak until they got back in the car. Then she said it out loud for the first time. "Michael, I don't think this is about adoption anymore." What if the children weren't orphans? What if they were recruited, or worse, bred? That night, Susan dug through archives, old newspapers, court records, birth announcements. She started with the earliest adopted child, a girl named Lila, supposedly taken in back in 1989. There was no record of her birth anywhere in Pennsylvania, but what Susan did find made her stomach twist. A missing persons report from Vermont. A 6-year-old girl, brown hair, green eyes, last seen near a rest stop, with a couple described by a witness as older, polite, religious. The sketch was a younger version of the Follings, and there was a pattern. One by one, Susan mapped the children, and each time a different town, a different child gone missing, and a Folling adoption a few weeks later. Different states, no overlap, no federal oversight, all buried under paperwork, false orphanages, a network of silence. Michael, meanwhile, discovered something worse, a ritual calendar, found in the background of one of Margaret's Facebook photos. At first he thought it was just a planner, but the symbols weren't dates, they were lunar phases, solstices, and next to them, initials, noted in ink, LC, Lila, CM, Caleb. Next to each symbol was a number. Age, weight, order of sacrifice. Michael whispered the word for the first time. They're not adopting these kids, they're collecting them. Susan finally understood. This wasn't just darkness, it was structured, it had rules, it had timing, and the next date circled in red ink was just 2 weeks away. September 23rd, autumn equinox. They had 14 days to stop whatever was coming next, or the 12th child would vanish into the system just like the others. The deeper they went, the less it felt like they were chasing answers, and more like they were digging up something that didn't want to be found. Susan barely slept now. Her home office became a war room, pushpins in maps, red string connecting towns, a whiteboard covered in dates and initials. She started calling it the litany, a list of every child, every location, every symbol. Michael focused on the Follings. He discovered that the couple had no real jobs, no listed income. Yet they owned property across 3 states, each one secluded. Each one bought under aliases through shell trusts and religious non-profits. But it wasn't just the houses. They owned a camp on the border of Ohio and West Virginia, a private summer camp that hadn't accepted a single new child in 7 years. But the lights were still on, the power bills paid, the website still active, with smiling children in outdated photos, the name of the camp, Sanctum's Rest. Michael called the number listed. A voice answered. Male, soft, calm. "Have you been chosen?" the man asked. Michael hesitated. I think I might have been. A pause. Then the voice said, "We'll see." Click. Within 2 hours, someone tried to break into Susan's garage. They didn't steal anything. They just left something. A child's shoe, size 6, covered in dried mud, tied to the shoelaces. A small wooden cross, hand-carved, the word forsake scratched into its surface with a nail. Susan didn't report it. She just locked the doors, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark with a kitchen knife trembling in her hand. That was when she received the email. No sender, just a subject line. "You are not the first." Attached was a single PDF. Margaret Hayes, Psychiatric Evaluation, 2011. It detailed hallucinations, paranoia, nightmares. She spoke of children being taken to the woods, of people with animal masks, of the black ram that walks like a man. Doctors dismissed it all as trauma-induced schizophrenia. But what chilled Susan most was the doctor's note at the bottom. Patient claims that the rituals occur only during specific lunar alignments. States that her adopted daughter was being prepared for the blood moon equinox ritual. Warns that the child must be removed from the Follings before her 12th birthday. Patient was sedated after attempting to escape facility with a smuggled blade. The date of that evaluation, September 19th, 2011, exactly 14 years before the date now circled on Susan's calendar. September 23rd. Michael stood over her shoulder, reading the report. He whispered, almost afraid to say it. "It's a cycle. Every 14 years, 12 children, and something happens on the equinox." He looked her in the eyes. "And if we don't stop it this time, there won't be another 14 years. There won't be anything left to stop." They needed help, but not from the police. They needed someone who believed. And there was one name they hadn't called yet, a woman listed in the margins of Margaret's psych file, scribbled in pen, barely legible. Ava S., former nun, excommunicated, knows the old rights. And below it, a phone number, Philadelphia area code. It was time to find the only person who had escaped this nightmare. And survived to tell the truth. Philadelphia was soaked in rain when Susan and Michael arrived. They didn't speak much on the drive. The weight of what they were uncovering sat like a stone in the back seat. Every radio station felt like noise, every billboard like a distraction sent to test their focus. They found Ava living in a crumbling brownstone on the outskirts of the city, a place with its windows permanently shut and curtains that never moved. Michael knocked 3 times. Nothing. He tried again. Then the door creaked open an inch. No words. Just one eye peering through the gap. Old. Cold. Suspicious. Susan spoke softly. "We're here about Margaret Hayes and the Follings." That did it. The door opened slowly, reluctantly. Ava looked nothing like a nun. She looked like someone who had seen God, and then watched him die. Her face was thin, worn. Her hands shook as she motioned them inside. 1,000 candles flickered on every surface, the smell of frankincense mixed with rot. Once seated, she offered no pleasantries, just one question. "How many are gone this time?" Michael didn't answer. Susan did. 9 confirmed. 3 more missing. Same pattern. Same signs. Ava nodded. Slowly, as if the world had finally caught up with her nightmare, she stood and pulled a cloth off a bulletin board covered in parchment and symbols. The right of the returning. They've been doing it since the 1600s, before America, before names like Folling or Hayes even mattered. These rituals, they aren't about hurting children. Not exactly. She turned to them, her eyes sharp. They believe they're saving them, preparing vessels for return. Susan's voice cracked. Return of what? Ava took a long breath, as if saying it aloud might bring it closer. A voice, a consciousness. It has a dozen names across cultures. The hollow shepherd, the black ram of the crooked path, the god I'd forgot its name. She pulled out a photograph. Old, faded, 12 children, all dressed in white, standing in a circle, each one holding a wooden cross, identical to the one left in Susan's garage. Every 14 years they gather 12 pure vessels. On the night of the blood moon equinox they offer them not in death, but in binding. The idea is to bring this god closer to our world, to merge it with human consciousness, to create a new thing, a hybrid of man and madness. Michael scoffed slightly. You actually believe that? Ava looked at him with a face that had seen the veil lifted. I didn't believe, until I watched a child speak in a voice older than language, until I saw a nun's eyes turn completely black, and her body float 5 feet above the altar. Susan's hands were trembling now. What do they want with us? Ava's answer was instant. To stop you. You're interfering with their calendar, and once the 12th child is taken, there's no stopping the rite. Michael leaned forward, desperate. Where do they do it, this final ritual? Where's it happen? Ava looked away, then whispered, St. Icarus Convent, abandoned since 1981, hidden in the woods near a dead town called Fallow Bridge. Susan recognized the name, so did Michael. It had been mentioned in one of the adoption contracts. Margaret had circled it years ago, writing just one word beside it. Origin. Ava gave them one final warning. If you go, you won't come back the same. Not all wounds bleed, and not all doors can be closed once opened. But they were already past the point of retreat. Whatever waited at St. Icarus, they would face it, because someone had to. And the equinox was only 5 nights away. They left Philadelphia in silence. The map Ava had given them was crude, a hand-drawn sketch showing a road that didn't exist on GPS, with a dotted path through dense woods marked only the old way. Susan stared out the window, trying to quiet the storm in her chest. Michael, hands tight on the wheel, glanced at her. You okay? She didn't answer. She wasn't. But they weren't children anymore. They were carrying the weight of every missing boy, every broken mother, every rotting record. By the time they reached the edge of Fallow Bridge, the sun was setting behind black trees. The entire town had been swallowed by nature. Boarded houses, cracked pavement, not a soul in sight. No birds, no wind. Even the air seemed held, like it had been warned not to move. Michael slowed the car as they approached a rusted iron gate. A sign hung crooked on one hinge, St. Icarus Convent, closed in perpetuity, and beneath it, in scratched red chalk, He still dreams in the bell tower. The gate opened on its own, not fast, not violently, just intentionally. They stepped out of the car and felt it. A pressure, like something massive was watching from beneath the soil. The convent was barely visible through the trees. A Gothic skeleton of cracked stone and ivy. Its bell tower loomed like a guillotine frozen mid-swing. Inside, the chapel door stood open. No lock, no chains, just the faint echo of whispering voices. They stepped in together. The inside was colder than the air outside. Not by degrees, by decades. A line of children's shoes lined the pews, dozens, different sizes, different styles, all neatly placed, side by side. On the altar was an open book. The pages were thick parchment, handwritten, each line detailed a rite, binding of voices to flesh, bleeding of time between worlds, diagrams drawn in circles, eyes within eyes, tongues sewn shut. But it wasn't until Susan saw the mural behind the altar that she broke. It had been painted over hundreds of times, but layer by layer had peeled away, and beneath it all, a final image had survived. 12 children, naked, eyes blank, standing in a ring of ash. Above them, not a god, but a thing, a head with no face, wings made of mouths, and we, where its heart should be, an eye wide open and bleeding. Michael stepped closer and saw names carved into the stone at the base, 12 names. The last one, Margaret Hayes. Susan turned and ran outside. She vomited into the grass. Michael followed, hand on her shoulder. We can't leave now. She wiped her mouth. I know, but I need one thing first. What? She looked at him. Proof. So no one ever forgets again. And that's when they heard it. The bell. It rang once, though the rope had long since rotted, though the mechanism had been dismantled in 1981, it rang again, and this time, they weren't alone. From the tree line, they came. Not children, not adults. Something in between, dressed in the white robes of altar boys, but with mouths stitched shut and eyes that had forgotten how to blink. They began to encircle the convent, and somewhere deep inside, a door creaked open that no one had touched. The rite had already begun. The bell rang a third time, low, wet, like something deep and organic had answered back. Michael backed toward the chapel doorway, dragging Susan with him. We go out. They're waiting. We stay in. We're trapped. She didn't respond. She was staring, not at the boys encircling the convent now in perfect silence, but at the bell tower, at the open hatch near its peak. Something was watching them from up there, not a person, not even a presence, an awareness, older than anything in that town, and it recognized them. Michael grabbed her hand. We have to get to the records room. That's what Ava said. Basement. Back hallway. We get in, get out, burn the place if we have to. But the hallway behind the chapel wasn't empty anymore. A figure was standing at the end of it. White robes, rosary around his neck, bald head, skin pale and thin like waxed parchment. He raised one hand and motioned. Come. Susan whispered. That's Father Mallory. Mike said. Hale stopped. What? He died in 1993, suicide. They buried him with the others. Father Mallory smiled, then turned and walked into the dark. No footsteps, no sound. Michael pulled out the flashlight, its flicker barely pushing through the thick, unnatural black. They followed, because they had no choice. Down a corridor whose dimensions felt wrong, like the walls leaned inward when you looked away, past doors that opened into rooms filled with children's drawings. But every face was scribbled out. Every adult had a mouth drawn too wide. At last, they reached the basement stairs. They weren't wood or concrete. They were carved stone, spiraling downward in a perfect coil, like a drain built for memories. Susan froze halfway down. Do you smell that? Michael did. Chalk, rot, and something worse. Something like blood that had never dried. At the bottom, a wooden door burned black at the edges. Above it, someone had carved into the brick, the archive of the unborn. Susan touched the door. It was cold. Michael braced for a noise, a movement, a scream. Instead, they heard only one thing. From deep behind that door, a lullaby. Soft, female, sung with the same cracked voice they'd heard on the cassette tape Ava had left them. Susan whispered almost to herself, It's her. Michael pushed open the door. Inside was a room made of stone and salt. Shelves upon shelves, all filled with small, hand-bound books. Every book had a name. Every name. One of the missing boys. Except not all of them were missing. Some books had red wax seals, others were open, and one, just one, was still being written. Ink formed words on its page in real time. Michael leaned in and read, Michael Granger, July 18th, 2025, Descent begins. The moment he said the words aloud, the lullaby stopped, and from behind the shelves, a voice, like silk torn over bone, whispered, You should not have come here, Michael. The door slammed shut behind them, and the lights, all candles, blew out in one breath. They were not alone anymore. The archive had woken. They didn't scream. Not yet. There wasn't even time for panic. Michael grabbed Susan and spun the flashlight around. But the beam bent. Not just flickered. Bent. As if the air itself had shape, pulling the light away from what it didn't want them to see. All around them, the walls of salt had changed. They weren't shelves anymore. They were alcoves, and in each alcove was a child-sized shape, some still, some breathing. Books were gone. Now there were only wax-sealed jars filled with teeth, hair, fingers, each labeled like a file. Boy 14C, Jacob, Year 3, unmade, number 29. Denied entry. Susan whispered, "Michael, this isn't an archive. It's a vault." He didn't reply. He couldn't. Because something had emerged from behind the alcoves, something thin, naked, but not of skin. Its body was made of parchment, stretched and stitched. Its face wore 3 mouths, none where a mouth should be, and in each it sang a different note from the same lullaby. "Sleep, sleep, you little one. Breathe no more 'neath mother's sun. God forgot you, love unsought. Back to silence you are brought." Michael backed away, but the salt underfoot cracked the moment it broke. The whispering began. From every alcove, every jar, every sealed name, a choir of dead children chanting a single phrase. "He has your name, he has your name, he has your name." Susan fell to her knees, clutching her stomach, sobbing, not in fear, in recognition. "I remember now," she whispered. "They brought me here. I was a girl. I was pregnant." Michael turned. His mouth opened, but nothing came out, because on the far wall, glowing faintly under some internal fire, was a mural, a painting of her, Susan, barely older than a teen, eyes wide, belly round, surrounded by women in veils, each holding needles, each cutting her name into the stone beneath her. And beneath that, name, a second, Michael, but not his, a name that belonged to the thing behind them. The parchment figure moved closer, its 3 mouths opened wider. "He lives in you, Mother," it whispered. "He wears your face, Father. You never left this place." Susan screamed, and the vault responded. The jars shattered, the salt walls began to collapse, and behind it all a staircase downward revealed itself. But it was not carved. It was grown, flesh, bone, vein-wrapped, a path leading deeper into the womb of the convent, and from below something was coming up, laughing, not like a child, not like a man, something that had never been born, but had been waiting to be remembered. Michael turned to Susan. "We go down. We find the altar. And we end this." Because above them, outside the chapel, the 15 altar boys were no longer just standing guard. They had begun to dig, not with shovels, with their hands, through soil and bone and stone, towards something that had been buried before the convent was even built. And in that dirt, beneath that altar, was the first womb, the original mistake, and the last door. Beneath the convent, the descent began. Michael held the flashlight like a weapon, though its beam barely pierced the air, now thick, almost chewing on the light. The stairs twisted, not in direction, but in material, from salt and stone to cartilage, then to something soft, wet, and alive. Every step produced a sound, not a footstep, but a heartbeat. Susan limped beside him, her breath shallow, her eyes wild. "This isn't just under the church," she whispered. "It's inside her." Michael paused. "Her?" Susan didn't answer, because the wall beside them opened its eye, not metaphorically. An actual human eye blinked open in the fleshy wall, watched them, then wept black tears that sizzled as they hit the floor. Dozens more eyes followed, hundreds, all watching, all with the same iris color. Susan's, the sound, and the sound, low, wetting, like a whisper sliding through a coffin lined with mucus, and a voice, not from a mouth, but from beneath their feet. "You came back incomplete." The stairs ended. Before them lay a cathedral-sized chamber, but it didn't feel hollow. It felt pressurized, like the air had memory, like it remembered everything that happened here. Susan grabbed Michael's hand and pointed. At the center of the chamber, under a beam of red light bleeding through cracks above, was an altar, but not of stone, of skulls, laid meticulously. Children's skulls, adult skulls, animal skulls, all bound with rosary chains made of hair, and on top of the altar lay Susan's body, pregnant, unmoving, but breathing. Michael stepped back. "No, that's not possible," Susan whispered. "That's me. When they took me." Then the figure behind the altar rose, 7 feet tall, veiled in blood-soaked cloth, wearing a crown made from the pelvis of a nun, no eyes, only scars in the shape of a cross inverted. Its voice did not echo, it invaded. "This is where all mothers are returned. This is where all mistakes are born again." Susan fell to her knees. Michael rushed to her, but she pushed him away. Her arms were shaking, her skin moved like something inside her was clawing upward. "I remember it all," she gasped. "The injections, the prayers, the voices in the dark telling me it wasn't a child, it was a vessel." Michael screamed, "We have to destroy it." The veiled priest lifted one hand, and from the shadows the altar boys arrived. But they had no mouths now, just black gaping holes where their faces used to be. Each held a candle that dripped blood, not wax, and they began to circle the altar, chanting from nowhere, "Deliver the child, deliver the blood, deliver the door." Michael moved to fight, but Susan grabbed his wrist and said, "He's not yours. He's not mine. He's hers." Michael turned to the altar, and the pregnant Susan opened her eyes, but they were not human. They were all 15 boys' eyes sewn into her face, and her mouth opened slowly, as a whisper poured from within. "I'm ready to be born now, Father." The ground shook, the altar split, and something slid out between her legs, something without form but not without presence, a baby, a man, a god, a regret. And it knew Michael's name. "You loved her," it whispered, "so you'll raise me. Just like you were raised in the dark." And behind Michael, the door sealed shut. There was only forward now, into the final descent, into the memory of the first undoing, into the birth of the impossible. Michael fell backward as the thing pulled itself free from Susan's body. It didn't cry. It didn't breathe. It didn't crawl. It floated. Umbilical cords still attached. Not one, but many. Stretching from its navel back into Susan's limp form, then into the altar, then into the floor itself. It was feeding from everything, from everyone. Michael blinked once, and the thing had moved inches from his face. Not fast, just inevitable. Its skin was translucent like wet parchment. Bones beneath seemed too many for a child. Its skull pulsed with veins shaped like scripture. No eyes, just black slits that stared inside rather than out. Michael turned to Susan. Her body was now hollowed, as if the birth had reversed her, skin caved in, jaw unhinged in silent horror, her womb an open window to the void. "Susan," the voice came again, from the thing, but not a child's voice. Michael heard his mother, then his father, then Susan, then a voice that sounded exactly like him. "You promised you'd save her. Instead, you came to remember." The altar boys encircled the newborn, still chanting, but their mouths were now sewn shut. The sound came from under their robes, from somewhere deep inside them. Michael tried to run, but the room stretched. Like a dream, every step made no ground, and then the red veil dropped. From the chamber ceiling, red banners unfurled like tongues, revealing the walls were lined with the faces of nuns, frozen in mid-scream, flesh melded into the architecture. Their eyes blinked in unison. And the child spoke again. "You know what they did here, you know what was buried, but knowing isn't saving, it's becoming." A light began to fill the space, not holy, not warm. A surgical light. Michael was no longer standing. He was strapped to a table, cold steel beneath him, white lights above. Figures in nun habits moved around him with needles the size of fingers. Their faces were blank porcelain masks, painted with expressions of maternal joy, smiling, weeping, laughing, but none of them matched their movements. He looked to his left, another table, and on it, himself, but younger. Open chest cavity, still alive, eyes flickering. "It always ends here," said the child, "because this is where you began." Michael's mind reeled. He remembered the letters, the church reports, the disappearance files, the whispers from St. Mary's over the decades, but no one ever thought to ask, where did the altar boys come from? Where did the nuns come from? Where did he come from? Because maybe this place didn't take children. Maybe it created them. Michael looked down at his own chest, and it was open, not cut, bloomed. Like something was flowering out of him. The child floated above. The first mother bore the first wound, and from that wound she bled time. You are not a visitor, Michael. You are the harvest. The altar lit with flame, not fire, but memory. Scenes flickered, the missing boys, the vanishing sisters, the abandoned confessions, all replayed in a loop, as if history wasn't linear here, but digestible, sacramental. Michael screamed, but no sound came, only a single thought repeated in his skull like a church bell. This place doesn't hide secrets. It births them. And Michael was next. Michael's mouth was open in a scream, but no air left his lungs. He wasn't just watching, he was splitting. His consciousness peeled away from his body like an old photograph dipped in acid, one half still strapped to the table, the other floating above, next to the child. He looked down. Below him the altar shimmered. It was no longer wood and stone. It was a mosaic of memories, of every child who had passed through St. Mary's, boys and girls, their final moments etched into the surface. Each tile was a different expression. Terror, confusion, ecstasy, nothingness. And in the center, pulsing like a heartbeat, was a void. Not black, not empty, just the absence of being, the place before names, before thought. The child turned to him. Its voice was now neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It was made of echoes, every cry ever muffled inside these walls. You're not the first to come searching. You're just the first to remember. Michael felt his other self, the one on the table, jolt violently as the nun figures injected thick black liquid into his neck. His veins turned dark, his eyes rolled back. You thought memory was salvation, the child whispered, but memory is the womb. And we are what grows from it. The room collapsed. Walls folded inward, ceiling melted upward. Reality tightened like a noose. Suddenly, Michael was standing in the original chapel again, but everything was aged. Burned pews, shattered glass, the crucifix now hanging upside down. The child floated before him, older now, no longer infant, now a boy of 12, pale, wide-eyed, and disturbingly familiar. "Do you see now?" the boy asked. "Why they disappeared?" "They didn't vanish, they transformed." The stained glass window behind the altar reassembled. But the figure in it wasn't Christ. It was a nun with a twisted smile, holding not a lamb, but a baby with no face. Its belly bore the mark Michael saw earlier, the symbol carved into the altar, Virga Inferni, the womb of the underworld. Michael looked at the boy again. "Who are you?" he whispered. The boy smiled, sad and wide. "I'm what you would have been if you had stayed. I'm what the altar wanted." Michael's breath caught. He suddenly remembered, not as a flashback, but as a truth he'd always known and buried. He had once lived here. He had been an altar boy, but he had been taken away, adopted by a distant relative. After a fire destroyed part of the church, he'd grown up thinking it was just a coincidence, a tragedy, but it wasn't. He was the only one who got out. And now, he'd come back. Not to investigate, to complete the ritual. The child reached out a hand. Your body is still here. Your soul is the last piece. The chapel's bells began to toll, deep, metallic, unnatural. Each chime bent the world around him, distorting time and form. The boy's hand remained outstretched, patient, eternal. Michael took a step back, but the ground beneath him was no longer stone. It was flesh, soft, breathing, pulsing in rhythm with the bells. Behind him, the chapel doors closed on their own, and the red veil began to descend once more. But this time, it wasn't fabric. It was blood, thick, warm, falling from above like a slow, deliberate rain. And in the distance, through the crimson haze, Michael heard them, the voices of the missing. "Come back, Michael. Finish what was started. We've been waiting." The boy took one final step forward. And Michael remembered his name wasn't Michael at all. It never had been. He was one of the 15, and now he was home. The truth settled into Michael, or whatever was left of him, like a stone in a still pond. He wasn't the outsider. He wasn't the witness. He was the final vessel, and St. Joseph's had been calling him back all along. The red veil now covered everything, not like a curtain, but like skin pulling taut over a skeleton. The chappie groaned, not with wood, but with something deeper, something biological. He was inside a womb, a cathedral made of memory and meat, and every whisper in the walls wasn't wind. They were the echoes of the other altar boys, still trapped inside this thing. Not dead, not living, something in between. Michael, or the boy he once was, knelt, not out of reverence, but instinct, submission, because something in him still remembered the rites. The child, now a mirror image of himself at age 10, stepped behind the altar. Its hands moved in circular gestures, slicing the air like a surgeon, and the altar, no longer stone, opened, like a ribcage splitting. Inside was a black chalice, steaming. Michael crawled toward it. Each movement forced flashes of memory through his mind. A line of boys walking into the woods, holding hands, a nun with no eyes humming a lullaby, a sermon where the priest spoke in tongues while the crucifix bled from the mouth. A birthday cake with 15 candles, but no faces around it. He reached the altar and looked up. The boy, his doppelganger, held the chalice forward. Its contents weren't liquid. They were names. 15 names, whispering in unison, dancing like smoke inside the cup. "Drink," the boy said calmly, "and you'll remember everything." Michael hesitated. His body trembled, but the moment his fingers touched the chalice, it bit him. Teeth, hidden in the rim, dug into his skin, drawing blood, and the cup drank him back. The smoke within turned red, and the room shuddered. Every candle burst into flame. The walls bled scripture. The organs in the balcony began to play a hymn no human had ever written. A lullaby in reverse. Michael screamed, but no one heard, because his mouth had vanished. His face was changing, molding, back into the boy he had been. Bones softened, skin tightened, teeth fell out and were replaced with newer, smaller ones. He was regressing, becoming one of the altar boys again. But not to relive, to join, to become part of the choir of two. He lost. Around him, shadows stepped forward. The others. The missing. The forgotten. One by one they emerged from the walls, their bodies half-formed, flickering between flesh and memory, each face partially erased by time. "Welcome back," they said in voices that weren't theirs. "The 15th candle has been lit." The boy, Michael, stood upright, eyes hollow, blood dripping from the corners of his mouth, and in that final moment a new stained glass window appeared above the altar. It depicted a young boy kneeling before a black chalice, surrounded by 15 faceless children. A Latin inscription ran beneath it. "In memoria, nos renascimur." In remembrance we are reborn. The chapel was now complete, the cycle had closed, the last altar boy had returned, and beneath St. Joseph's, the ground sighed. It had been fed, the whispers faded, the red veil lifted. Outside, the town remained silent, unaware. Because the truth of what lay beneath their feet, of what the church had built, was buried under decades of obedience, forgotten rituals, and sacred lies. But now the choir was whole again, and they were ready to sing forever. The morning sun rose over the quiet town of Barrow's End, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like an afterthought, like the light was late to something ancient. People went about their routines, opening shops, sweeping porches, walking their dogs, but there was a heaviness in the air, an invisible pressure, a wrongness they couldn't name. They would look at St. Joseph's Church, at its towering spire and the bell that hadn't rung in years, and feel something cold crawl along their skin, something like déjà vu but with teeth. None of them could explain why they avoided walking too close to the gates, or why their children cried when they saw the stained glass windows. Something had shifted, but no one would say it aloud, because no one wanted to remember. Michael's apartment sat undisturbed, coffee grounds in the filter, a notepad on the table with half-scribbled questions about the case, his car still in the lot. The police would eventually come. They'd knock, look around, take notes, but without a missing persons report, nothing would stick. Michael had no family, no spouse, no siblings, just his obsession, and that obsession had consumed him. Back beneath the chapel, behind the hidden door, the sacred passage had sealed. The bricks were dry again, the smell of blood and candles replaced by stone and dust, but deeper still, beyond the layers of earth and time. The choir began to sing, not with sound, but with vibration, a low hum that made the bones of the earth ache. The boys were seated in a perfect circle, hands clasped, eyes closed. Their mouths did not move, but their throats pulsed, and in the center of the circle, where once there was an altar, now there was a cradle. Inside, something stirred. It wasn't a child, not yet. It was the impression of one, a formless thing, built from every memory, every ritual, every chant and tear and scream. It was the thing the priests had worshipped, the thing the nuns had bled for, the thing the 15 boys had slowly given themselves to, one by one. And now, it was nearly ready, because the 15th soul had returned. Michael was no longer Michael. He was a voice in the choir, a name in the smoke, a thread in the tapestry of something far older, far darker, and far more patient than anyone had ever understood. Above them, in the stillness of the chapel, the stained glass window depicting Michael and the 15 boys flickered, just once, a shimmer of movement like light bending around truth, and if someone, anyone, had been there to look closely, they would have seen something impossible. A 16th candle being added to the window. The cycle was not done. It was expanding. Back in the town, a young girl named Clara was drawing on the sidewalk with chalk. She paused, staring up at the church. Her eyes went wide. Her hand trembled. She dropped the chalk and whispered something her parents would never understand. "They're calling again." And deep below, the choir hummed louder. Their song was not for worship. It was for awakening. The cradle would soon be full, and when it was, Barrow's End would forget what peace ever felt like. The town's clocks ticked forward, but time had started to lose its meaning. People noticed in subtle ways. Lights would flicker at the same hour every night, 3:17 a.m. Dogs barked at empty corners. Cell phones lost signal only near the church, even though there was a tower just a block away. And then there were the dreams. Clara's mother, Denise, hadn't slept soundly in weeks. Each night she'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, heart hammering like it was trying to warn her. The dreams always began the same. She's in the chapel. It's empty. A single boy is sitting in the front pew with his back turned. He turns, and his eyes are hollow. No irises, no pupils, just black tunnels. And inside them, she sees herself screaming. The therapist told her it was stress. The priest said it was spiritual unrest. But Denise knew neither of them were right, because every time she had the dream, she'd wake up with dirt under her fingernails. as if she had clawed her way out of the earth, or worse, as if something had clawed its way into her. Back beneath St. Joseph's, the boys had stopped humming. Now they listened. To the thing in the cradle, its form had begun to take shape, not like flesh, not like any human child, but like a remembrance. The memory of what had once walked between the stars and whispered to the early priests, the first sin wrapped in silken song, the thing that demanded silence not out of reverence, but because its true name would shatter the tongue. It didn't need language, it had hunger, and it was nearly born. Michael's form had dissolved. No bones, no skin, no organs, just a voice, echoing endlessly in the space. Between the boys, he had become part of the script, part of the pattern etched into the walls, the floor, the altar stones, and the blood-soaked garments buried beneath centuries of renovations. The church above had been rebuilt 7 times, but always in the same place, always in the shape of a cage, a geometric prison, a mathematical lock holding back a god not meant to awaken. But someone had found the key, not with intention, with curiosity, with journalism, with questions no one should have asked. And now? Now the foundation cracked, not with noise, but with heat. A low warmth rising through the chapel floor, invisible, but ancient. Denise, Clara, and 26 other townspeople would report night sweats over the next 3 days. None of them knew each other. None of them visited the church. But they had all dreamed of the same thing. A cradle of stone, pulsing with light, and a voice, gentle and terrifying, whispering the same 7 words. You were never meant to be free. Up on the hill, the old bell in the steeple rattled for the first time in 73 years. No one touched it, no one saw it. But the sound echoed like thunder across Barrow's End, and every child who heard it stopped what they were doing and stared. Not at the church, at the ground beneath them, as if something below had finally stirred, as if it had just opened its eyes. The first to collapse was the mailman. Tuesday morning, 7:02 a.m., right outside the rectory gates. He had just stepped onto the stone walkway when he froze, letters slipping from his hands as if gravity itself had changed around him. Then his knees buckled. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just screamed. A long, wet sound like a goat being strangled. Primal and wrong. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was conscious again, silent, breathing, staring. But he wouldn't enter his own house, wouldn't speak his wife's name, wouldn't. To cross thresholds, when they asked what happened, he simply whispered, "She looked at me from under the stones." The townspeople said he'd gone mad, but Clara knew better. She had seen the pattern, on walls, on notebooks, even on the collar of the priest's robes during Mass. Spirals, geometries that bent when you stared too long, drawings that appeared in the margins of her homework without her memory of doing so. And that humming, the one she'd thought was tinnitus, it was getting louder, but only when she was near St. Joseph's. Inside the archives, the journalist had made progress. Too much. He had broken the parish seal and found a redacted codex buried beneath the usual baptism records. It was handwritten in Latin, a twisted dialect not seen since the Black Plague swept Europe. The title read, Scriptum Sanguinis Infantum, the writ of the blood of children. Inside were over 300 pages of diagrams, rites, and ritualistic calendars. None referenced God, none referenced Jesus. Instead, it spoke of a lesser father, an entity not worshipped but fed, an entity that required no praise, only presence. He cross-referenced the dates. Every 7 years, one child had vanished, always between the spring thaw and the solstice, always during Pentecost. But here was the most chilling detail. Each boy's full name began with the same letter as the one before him. Michael, Nathan, Oliver, Paul, Quentin. It was an alphabet of sacrifice, a contract, a countdown. Clara was no longer just a curious girl. She was next. Her brother, Samuel, had vanished last Pentecost. And her name? Tobias. The pattern wasn't just geometric. It was linguistic, ritualistic, living. Each generation renewed it, unknowingly or not. The stained glass windows of St. Joseph's weren't just art. They were sigils, mirrors into something deeper. Each pane a layer of the prison. Each story told in colored light. A warning disguised as worship. On Wednesday night, the local pastor, Father Bryn, went missing. They found his shoes in the confessional. The door had been sealed from the inside. No sign of struggle, only a single note scrawled onto the back of a hymn sheet. It is not death that waits in the earth. It is the first voice. Meanwhile, in the empty underground chamber, the boys stood motionless, mouths closed, eyes unblinking, but their shadows twitched as if they belonged to someone else. And in the cradle, the stone began to flake, hairline fractures running like veins through its surface. A cry echoed, not human, not animal, but familiar, as if it had been waiting for thousands of years to be born again, and the world had finally said yes. The cry echoed twice, once through the air, once inside the body, like bone hearing bone. Tobias jolted awake in bed, sweat soaked through the sheets, nails bitten to the quick. He hadn't screamed, but his mother had already burst through the door, not because she'd heard anything, but because all the clocks in the house had stopped. At 3:22 a.m., exactly, not a second before or after, digital, analog, even her wristwatch. The second hand just sat there, frozen, like it was waiting for permission. She whispered his name once, twice. On the third time, Tobias looked at her and said, "They opened the cradle." He didn't know why, didn't know how, but the words came from somewhere below his breath, and behind his eyes, he saw the altar, the cradle, the robed figures, the broken stone, and something crawling out. That same night, 47 miles away in a different parish, a young seminarian named Marcus, who had never even heard of St. Joseph's, began scribbling frantically in the dark. He would later claim he didn't know what he was writing, but when his mentor came in at dawn, he found the walls of the dormitory covered top to bottom in a single repeated phrase. The boy opens the way, the priest seals the gate, the blood is the lock, the cradle is the key. Over and over, in languages Marcus did not speak, Aramaic, Greek, Akkadian, and one that couldn't be translated, only felt. Back in Elmvale, Clara snuck into the rectory archives again. The air was colder now, not chilled but emptied, like whatever had been breathing inside the walls was now outside them. She pulled the priest's daily journal. The last 10 pages were torn out, but she found a handwritten entry from 18 years ago, the day before the first boy had disappeared. "We've lost the last of the old nuns. Sister Magdalene passed this morning in silence. Before she went, she whispered a warning, said we forgot the real purpose of the confession box. It's not for the living, it's for listening to the ones who haven't left. I opened it anyway. Now they speak to the boys. They do not speak to me. I think they never did." The next morning, the town awoke to a power outage, but it wasn't the grid. It was the sun. It rose late, and not where it was supposed to. A local astronomer tried to calculate the new azimuth. She couldn't, because the stars had shifted too, by 3 degrees, exactly, as if something enormous had pivoted beneath the town, as if the land itself had turned ever so slightly toward something watching. The journalist, now holed up in a motel outside town, received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was a child, but the words were not childlike. "You were not meant to read the codex. You were meant to feed it. But now the time's wrong, and the lock is broken. The gate swings anyway." Then silence, then breathing, then something that sounded like hooves on wood, and the call dropped. He didn't sleep that night, not because he was afraid, but because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the missing boys standing in a circle, mouths sewn shut with rosary wire, eyes carved with symbols, and in the center, a priest, but not our kind, older, wearing a collar of bone and holding the missing pages, reading them, aloud. The Storm rolled in like a shroud, not on the horizon but from below the hills, a reverse fog, not mist but memory, thick, black, humming. Clara watched from her attic window, fingers trembling against the glass. In the distance, the steeple of St. Joseph's shuddered, ever so slightly as if breathing in the storm. The townspeople couldn't explain it. The sky wasn't just dark, it was colorless. No blue, no grey, only absence. As if the palette of the world had been scraped off and replaced by something older, from before light had names. Down in the church crypts, something clicked. Not a mechanical click, a vertebral one. Something coming undone at the base of the town's spine. An ossuary vault, sealed since 1913, cracked open with no force, no tools. Just an invitation. Inside, not bones, but teeth. Rows of them. Hundreds. Filed into spirals, arranged in sigils, coated in wax and scripture. Each one belonged to a child, but none from the parish, all from elsewhere. Records tucked neatly in vellum scrolls showed shipping manifests from across oceans, Argentina, Poland, Ethiopia, Burma, all dated between 1870 and 1922, all signed in red ink, and beneath each signature an identical stamp, Custodia Cradle, Ordo 322. The journalist drove back into Elmvale, though every instinct screamed against it. The GPS no longer worked. Not offline, not online. Street signs had subtly changed, not in words, but in angle. Everything leaned slightly left, like the town was twisting into its own shadow. He parked near the parish and approached the doors. They opened on their own. Inside, the pews were overturned. Not vandalized, rearranged, into a circle. In the center, a single candle, burning upside down, flame curling into the wax. A Bible lay nearby. Every page was intact, except one. Genesis chapter 4. The story of Cain and Abel, torn out. In its place, a hand-scrawled sentence, as brother killed brother to stop the voice from spreading, but the voice knew how to make another. At that moment, 322 miles away, exactly, in a cloistered monastery in Idaho, an old monk rose from bed screaming a single phrase, "The voice has found the boy again." He died minutes later, from spontaneous cranial bleeding. No aneurysm, no trauma, just a complete rupture of the inner ear and pineal gland, as if something had whispered through him, and kept going. Back in Elmvale, Clara met Tobias again, this time in the ruins of the old schoolhouse. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't even himself. He spoke calmly, fluently, in a dialect Clara didn't recognize. But every word struck her like déjà vu, as if she'd read them in a dream. He said, "They chose this parish because it was already hollow. No faith, no fight, just ritual. They built the cradle beneath the altar, but the key was never in the cradle. It was in the breath of the first boy who could still hear the singing." Clara asked, "What singing?" Tobias only smiled, then hummed, and the walls began to sweat. Not moisture, ink, dripping down from beams, etching verses onto the floor, revealing an enormous diagram, a map, of the town, of the past, of the ritual, of the next disappearance, and in the center, a sigil. The same symbol carved into every altar boy's bed frame since 1952. 3 lines, 2 loops, and a single eye, wide open, staring up. Not at God, but at something older, something watching him. The diagram stretched across the floorboards like a living nerve system, inked arteries pulsing with unseen currents. Clara stepped back instinctively as the sigil at its center seemed to throb, not just visually but sonically. It rang in her bones, a frequency too deep for the ear, but perfectly calibrated for the soul. Tobias, or whatever inhabited his body now, stood calm-witted, thin, the center of it all. His eyes, once filled with a child's fear, now carried a centuries-old patience, the kind only found in those who have already watched empires die. "They didn't vanish," he whispered. "They were invited." Clara stared at him, blinking back tears. "The boys?" He nodded. "All of them, one by one, ritual by ritual, night by night. They were taken not by force, but by recognition. The order doesn't abduct, it selects, it awakens." A pulse shivered through the air. The candle in the corner flared again backwards. Suddenly Clara felt it, a presence just outside the threshold of the schoolhouse, watching, not with eyes, but with memory. It knew her blood, and it had been waiting. Back at the church, the journalist, Peter, descended into the sub-level crypts, guided by the sounds of distant, childlike chanting. Each footstep echoed twice, once in the space and once in the mind. He passed ossified confessional booths, walls lined with candle niches. All of them melted upwards. Every surface bore claw marks, not scratches of violence but scraping from within, as if the architecture had been trying to escape itself. He reached the final vault. The door was stone, sealed with iron vines, clearly ancient, yet covered in fresh fingerprints. There was no handle, just a shallow indentation in the shape of a child's jaw. The chanting grew louder. He placed his palm over the mark. The stone shuddered, not from pressure, but as if it recognized the warmth of truth. It opened. Inside, rows of wooden mannequins dressed in altar boy robes, all of them headless, all of them arranged in prayer. Their necks were fitted with copper rings, not mechanical but ornamental, each etched with Latin prayers that looped into themselves infinitely. Above them, carved into the ceiling, Domine, non sum dignus. Lord, I am not worthy. But beneath that, another line hidden in shadow, one never sanctioned by any scripture. But you shall still speak through me. Peter turned his flashlight up and froze, because above the mannequins was a mural, a single massive face, and not of Christ. It was the boy, Tobias, mouth open, eyes bleeding ink, as if in the moment of giving his voice, and painted around his head was not a halo, but a labyrinth. In the attic, Clara clutched an old family Bible, flipping through the margins where her great-grandfather, also a priest, had scrawled notes. She had never noticed them before. Now they leapt off the page. Eldest children, firstborn, choir-trained, all share the rarest cadence, the same note they claim angels once spoke in. They call it the whisper key. Next to that, a final line, underlined twice. Elmvale was chosen because it holds the key's echo. She looked at Tobias. He smiled, and began humming again. The windows fogged instantly, but not with condensation. With breath from the outside, something was moving through Elmvale now. Not walking, not flying. It moved like sound. It moved through memory. And it was heading back to the church, not to destroy it, but to complete the ritual. Elmvale's streets were no longer empty. They looked deserted, yes, but something beneath the blacktop and behind the brick facades had stirred. Lights flickered not because of failing power, but because the pattern of electricity was being rewritten. Inside every home, forgotten radios switched on by themselves, dialed to stations long defunct, and from them came a whisper. A single voice, multiplied into choir. Vox puer, lux tenebris. The child's voice is the light in darkness. Back in the subchamber beneath the church, Peter stepped deeper into the cathedral of mannequins. He filmed everything, hands shaking, not from fear but from recognition. Something in the air told him this was not new. He passed each wooden figure, noticing now that every altar boy had a small hollow in their chest. A circle, a devote, as if something had once been embedded and violently removed. From above, dripping onto his jacket, came black droplets. He looked up. The mural of Tobias had changed. His eyes, once weeping ink, were now open and watching. Peter dropped his camera and sprinted out, but the moment he turned, the vault door slammed shut behind him. From the walls, an unseen pipe groaned. No, not pipe. organ. The entire subchamber began vibrating as the deepest note ever conceived was played, not by fingers, by memory, and the mannequins moved. First their heads, or what remained of them, tilted upward in unison, then their arms raised slowly into mock prayer, creaking with a sound like bone on old wood. They began to hum. Peter collapsed to his knees, screaming through clenched teeth as the sound bored into his spine. He understood now why no one left Elmvale could speak of what happened. They literally couldn't. The ritual didn't just erase people, it recomposed them. Back in the attic, Clara gasped, snapping shut the family Bible. Tobias's humming had grown louder. The diagram on the floor shimmered, becoming a mirrored surface, reflecting not the room, but another place entirely. A vast underground hall filled with candles, mannequins, and one living boy trapped at the center. "Peter," she whispered. She saw him. He couldn't hear her, but he saw her. Their eyes met across this impossible mirror, and Peter mouthed two words: "Don't finish." But behind Clara, Tobias extended a hand, not menacingly but gently, like a conductor inviting the orchestra's final movement. "Please," he said softly. "It's almost complete." He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a vessel. Clara stared at him, the mirror, the diagram, and the flickering candles that now pulsed in time with her heartbeat. And she realized the humming was inside her too, passed down, nurtured, hidden in lullabies, hymns, bedtime stories, embedded in blood. She was the final verse. The ritual wasn't about collecting boys, it was about building the choir, a perfect harmonic configuration to open something, not a gate, not a portal, but a voice buried so deep in creation that only this many souls, shaped just so, could sing it awake. And she was the conductor. Suddenly, the air in the room pressed inward, and all the windows fractured, not shattered but peeled, like something was being peeled back from reality itself. Clara stepped forward. The diagram accepted her. The mirror brightened, and somewhere in the dark belly of Elmvale, something very, very old took its first breath in 177 years. Elmvale was no longer tethered to one reality. The seams that had held it in place, through prayer, silence, and forgetfulness, had torn. It began subtly. An unnatural fog rolled in, not from the sky, but from the cracks in the ground, seeping up like breath from a long dead lung. Birds froze mid-flight. Clocks ticked backward. The town's boundaries stretched and shrank in impossible loops, streets folding in on themselves like a Mobius strip. Time had become an instrument, and someone had started to play it. Peter knelt in the candlelit subchamber, the air thick with burnt wax and cedar rot. Around him, the mannequins, no longer idle, began a slow, synchronized movement, swaying as though moved by unseen tides. They weren't dolls, they were vessels. Each once a child, not dead, but stripped, voices removed. Souls not destroyed, but transposed into another key. This wasn't possession. It was arrangement. Peter reached for his pocket and pulled out the old photograph, the one he found in the priest's ledger, the altar boys of 1936. He now recognized every face in this chamber, and in the center of the photo, Tobias. But not the Tobias he knew. This one looked older than his years, like he'd been through this loop before. Peter's eyes widened. They weren't summoning Tobias. Tobias was the summoner, and he had been doing this across centuries, wearing different names in different towns, always hidden. Beneath rituals disguised as tragedy, Tobias wasn't just a victim, he was a chord, a living frequency, and now Clara had joined him. In the attic, the mirror's surface grew into a glowing vortex, not spinning but pulsing like a heartbeat. Tobias stood inside the circle, his arms raised. Clara stood beside him, trembling, not from fear, but from a sensation far stranger, belonging. Her voice rose, not on her own, but as if guided by memory, not hers. The song came from somewhere behind her ribs. a melody woven through her lineage, through generations of women in silence. Agnus Dei, qui tollis, peccata mundi. Not Latin, not really. The words were older. They used Latin like a mask, but beneath it was something ancient, pre-language. And the house began to respond. Books lifted into the air, pages fluttering open to identical symbols, spirals, eyes, hands with 7 fingers, and something resembling a mouth beneath the earth. Through the mirror, Peter screamed, "Clara, stop! You don't understand what it wants." But Clara did. She understood now. It didn't want to come into our world. It wanted to turn our world into itself, and it was using the song, the ritual, not as a key, but as sheet music, a composition of souls, each carefully chosen, tuned, and preserved. Tobias looked at Clara with those infinite eyes. "Sing the next verse, and you'll see your mother again." And with that, her voice cracked open the sky. In the Elmvale police station, Detective Mira's computer screen began flashing erratically. Every case file of every missing boy opened at once, each photo blurred, then focused into the same face. Tobias, even those who had disappeared in the 1800s. "My God," she whispered. "He's been repeating himself. No, copying himself. Through time. Through bloodlines, through sound. A perfect echo. And now, the echo had become loud enough to reshape matter. Mira looked outside. The church steeple was twisting, like soft wax under a magnifying glass. Above it, the clouds opened, not in light, but in music. Low, endless, impossible tones rolled across the town like thunder underwater. And then came the screams. Not from mouths, but from buildings. The town was beginning to sing back. They say buildings can't scream, that walls are mute, that structures, no matter how long they stand, don't carry memory. Elmvale proved them wrong. The entire town was vibrating now, as if the foundation itself had been tuned to a frequency just slightly out of phase with reality. The bricks groaned, nails twisted from wood as though trying to escape, roof tiles shattered from sound waves no human could hear, yet every soul could feel. And in that noise was a choir, not one of angels, one of the forgotten. Peter stumbled out of the house, Clara's voice still echoing behind him, shattering the windows in harmonic pulses. The streets were alive, bending like ribbon beneath his feet. Lampposts flickered Morse code in dead languages. Somewhere a church bell rang, 7 times. He turned the corner. Where the library once stood was now a spire of bone-white stone, shaped like an organ pipe, humming with low, throbbing light. Around it townsfolk stood silently, heads tilted, eyes rolled white, humming in unison, not possessed, tuned. Each of them struck like notes on a celestial piano, vibrating in tandem to the ritual Tobias had restarted. Peter gasped. This wasn't resurrection. This wasn't even worship. This was arrangement. A world turned into a composition. Every building, every life, every loss, a measure, a chord, a note in a symphony designed not to be heard, but to be felt by something older than time. In the attic, Clara collapsed. Not from exhaustion, but from clarity. Visions poured into her, not as images, but as sensations. She felt her mother's last breath, the warmth, the fear, the surrender. She saw Tobias, or the thing behind his eyes,